corporate venture building works usually when the corporate has an asset, or we call it an unfair advantage. So they have a technology or they have market access that they can leverage to build a venture. If a corporate would go head to head with startup founders, VC backed, on a greenfield setting, the corporate would almost always lose because they are too slow. In GDR, my father with his labor job earned more than my mother. And when the wall fell, it changed and my mother earned more than my father. And that continues to date. That in the GDR, I read a statistic recently that at least in parts, women earn more than men.
Alex Thieme is an associate partner at Bridgemaker, a well-respected corporate venture builder based in Berlin. Now, corporate venture building isn't something I know too much about, and it's significantly different from the VC world. So that's why I was keen to get him on the show to basically explain why it happens and what it all looks like in practice. Now, Alex explains this in great detail with lots of working examples. But we then go on to Alex's own journey and his upbringing in the former Eastern Germany bloc, and how this shaped his outlook and how he bucked the trend to progress in the business world. A fascinating discussion. I really enjoyed speaking with him, and I hope you give this one a listen. So, without further ado, I'm Alex Bloisey, and this is the Building Our World podcast. So, Alex, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Pleasure to have you. Now, I wanted to get you on because you are in the venture building world, and that is different from venture capital. So what I'd love to do first, because it's something I don't really know much about, maybe I'm just in my sort of VC bubble and I don't think that's a good thing. What is venture building and how does it sort of contrast from venture capital?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. Looking much forward to the discussion. So what is venture building? So basically, on the outset, the difference between venture capital is a venture capitalist would invest, and a venture builder, as the name says, builds a venture, right? And someone else needs to invest. And for us at Bridgemaker, we are a corporate venture builder, which means we build corporate startups. So we help whenever a corporate wants to build a new startup, we help them get the startup off the ground.
Oh, I see. Okay. So it's like the big corporate, say for in Germany, like Siemens would be, how would it work? Would say a manager have a particular idea? Like, is it more for like entrepreneurs who would want to build something out?
Yeah. So let's take a company that we all know, Volkswagen. So they were founded, I don't know, I think in the 30s. So they are doing cars since roughly 100 years, right? And the main thing they did is they do incremental, what we call incremental innovation. So if you're as old as me, you notice that your car, on the way they got an air conditioner at some point. They got the electric window adjustment. They got maybe a GPS system and so forth. So the car got better and better, right? And the engine got better and so forth. That's incremental innovation. That's done by engineers. And sometimes they create new business out of it. So for example, nowadays, if your Volkswagen wants to, if you want, as a customer, you want to have a parking assistant, for example, they say, okay, fine, it's 500 euros, right? So they monetize incremental innovation Sometimes they can't monetize it because it's just about keeping up with the market. Now, the next one is like what we call non-incremental innovation, and there are different aspects to it. So if we stick to the Volkswagen example, the electric vehicle, it's a non-incremental innovation, right? Going from a diesel engine for the engineers, it's pretty hard to conceive an electric engine. Now they do that, but they lack technical knowledge. For example, they lack battery technology. So now what Volkswagen does in that sense, and what all the other OEMs do, they invest in battery companies. So because they have to buy the technology that they can't develop themselves. So that is corporate venture capital, or sometimes corporate M&A, depending on the degree of control they want to have. And then the third angle is it's also a leapfrog, but in terms of business model, and that's where venture building comes into play. So for the Volkswagen example, it would be they are in the business of selling cars. Now they notice, hey, there's taxi, there's car sharing, there's car subscription. It's a different business model. They cannot go, if you're a Herbadis, you cannot go to your dealers and say, hey, put up a car sharing. It doesn't work, right? So that's when they go and they say, we have to get out of the corporate and we have to build a new corporate startup. And in the case of Volkswagen, in Berlin, you might have seen WeShare, right? That's a classic corporate venture. It works. It takes asset from the corporate. In that case, they take of course they take the cars, obviously, maybe also the maintenance from Volkswagen. But it's a totally new business model. They are not just selling a car to someone else and that person then takes care of the car for the next 2 to 10 years, but they are handing out a car for 20 minutes, and they are responsible suddenly for charging the car, for changing the tires, and do all that stuff. And because they cannot do it in their environment, they take it out, and that's when it becomes a corporate venture. And because especially the traditional companies like the Siemens and the Volkswagen and the Deutsche Bahn of this world, internally they are not equipped to do that themselves, because people who would like to build startups, they don't work in a corporate, right? They work in a startup. That's why they don't have the people, and that's why they work with people like us. Either they buy a startup or they work with people like us to build startups for them.
Okay, so they have this idea, they need to go into this new market, but they don't have the expertise within their own company to like the entrepreneur to take it on, the sales and marketing, I mean, hiring, literally everything. So that is the gap that you fill.
It's basically a totally different way of working. So in a corporate, if you always think about making something 5% better for the next year, it's a totally different thing versus saying we enter a totally new market with a totally new product. You have to take risks, you have to invent new ways, you have to build up things from scratch, and you are on a totally different level of comfort, right? And it's a question of skill in the corporate, but also a question of mentality and of methodology.
Okay. So, I mean, how does this work in practice? Because I think we're all well versed, well, maybe I am, into the VC side of things, where you have an entrepreneur or a couple of entrepreneurs who go pitch to investors their idea, and basically give us some money, and we're going to go and execute, and then give you a little bit back. This is obviously different. So they come to you. So at Bridgemaker and other similar venture builders, do you kind of have people ready to go who can come in and start building?
Exactly. So there's both ways. Sometimes, and it happens quite a lot, the corporate comes to us. They have worked on an idea for 1 year, 2 years. It's common that they have a technology ready because that's what they do well, but they struggle to get the product to market. And then they come to us and they say, hey, can you help us? And then we help them get the startup off the ground. Sometimes we also tell them, hey, it's a nice technology, but it will never work, right? So we do what a classic founder would also do. You do custom interviews and you try to figure out, are you actually solving a problem, right? And if you solve a problem, then you go and you start building.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I hear it all the time from investors as well, when people just build something that that nobody actually wants. But if you haven't done that kind of user feedback and that customer feedback, you don't really find out. And I know people get stuck in their own ideas as well.
Yeah, and that, to be honest, is even more prominent in the corporate environment because of the mechanics of the economics. So let's say you want to build a startup, right? You need to worry how you get your money for next month, in 2 months, and in 3 months. So at some point you get your own pressure to, hey, I need to figure out if it actually works, or if I'm onto something that will never pay my bills, right? So of course, as a founder, the pre-seed round, maybe you can fake with a nice vision, but at some point not. But in a corporate setup, let's say you're a corporate manager. I mean, the corporate is paying your bill no matter what, right?
Yeah.
And so you get your paycheck, and that's sometimes that that um that like the pressure to actually go to the market never builds up, and that leads to them sometimes corporates like sticking around with an idea for a very long time, much longer than a startup would, because a startup would run out of money if they would continue like that.
Well, there's nothing like an entrepreneur or founder with their back against the wall that needs to deliver. There's nothing quite. There's nothing like that focuses a founder. So yeah, I agree with that in terms of
Yeah.
the money running out.
Yeah.
Okay, so they come to you and they need sort of this thing built. So they find out sort of, you've worked out that there's a product market fit there. Are you kind of recruiting founders, or is that coming from the corporate? How is this kind of entrepreneur coming in? Who's driving that?
Yeah. So in that sense, we work like in the older days in the startup world, you had these abundance of incubators. So we are and now it's less because there's a very well experienced startup community where young founders get help elsewhere and they don't necessarily need to work with the incubators, but some of them still do. And we are like an incubator for the corporate world, so we provide all the services that you need for a startup. So yes, we would recruit, among others, we would recruit the founding team, we would recruit other people into the venture until basically the venture is on their own feet, and then they work like a normal startup and doing their own decisions.
Okay. And will that founder get majority equity eventually? How does that work? How do you get paid, I suppose?
Yeah, so okay, that's two questions. So the way Bridgemaker gets paid is we we have two models. One is a service model, so it's fee for service, similar to a consultancy. And the other one is we take equity stakes in the ventures, but a minority stake, usually a small one. It's just to align our interests to the interest of the venture, so that we, unlike corporate managers would do, who usually have zero stake in the venture, we are actually aligned, and we work towards the success. We think like an investor, right? That's why we also usually we push ourselves for a minority stake. And obviously, if the venture works, then it's a nice upside for Bridgemaker. And in terms of the founders, so that would be, sometimes it's a Bridgemaker person. So, I mean, we have a lot of builders at Bridgemaker, right? People who want to work in a startup and build startups in a corporate setting, but still build startups. Sometimes our people leave Bridgemaker and then go towards a C-level role or a head of role in a venture, and then they would get equity. And sometimes we hire from the outside. Independent of who, like if the founder comes from Bridgemaker or from the outside, the founder would get equity but not majority stake, because the essence, actually we have setups where the founder gets majority stake, but normally when a corporate wants to build a corporate venture, it's about having a strategic interest from the part of the corporate, and that's why the corporate would usually want to have a controlling stake. It's changing now a little bit, and some corporates are okay with getting a minority stake, and now that opens up a lot of possibilities for higher founder shares, but also for getting classic VCs on board. So that's happening. That's sort of a development that's happening in corporate venture building. But the classic corporate venture building is really the corporate having a majority of the shares, and the rest is then split up between the founders, and the corporate venture builder gets a little bit of the shares.
Okay, so there's obviously a lot of positives with this approach because you're building it, you have the expertise, and you can kind of rule things out. You can rule out whether there's a product market fit quite quickly. Would you say, I know it's a bit of a leading question, would you say that this is better than the kind of VC approach where maybe it's sort of quite timely we're speaking now, where we've seen basically years of charismatic founders pitching to investors an idea that isn't profitable, that isn't going to work, but have managed to secure millions in capital because it's just been so cheap and the market conditions have allowed it. Does this way you're doing it, the venture building side of things, almost eliminate that kind of risk?
Yes, although I don't want to bash the VC world here, because I think venture capital has led a lot of groundbreaking innovation, right? And obviously it also had the effects that you just mentioned, and they are certainly less for venture building or corporate venture building because there's not such an abundance of capital. So yes, in our case it's different, but I think both streams, they work in parallel, and depends a little bit what you want to achieve. So for really groundbreaking innovation, like you want to go to the moon, for example, it's probably better to do that from scratch with lots of capital, and then knowing that this capital might never materialize into something tangible, right? And also about questions whether it's even desirable for humanity, but I think it's not part of today. Corporate venture building works usually when the corporate has an asset, or we call it an unfair advantage. So they have a technology or they have market access that they can leverage to build a venture. If a corporate would go head to head with startup founders, VC backed, on a greenfield setting, the corporate would almost always lose because they are too slow. Yeah, so
Okay.
so the critical thing when you think about venture building is really like in the sense of if you come back to the WeShare example, Volkswagen has access to cars, right? They can actually control how many of their cars they give to other car sharing providers. So that's actually a huge asset they have, and they can also seamlessly manage between a car sharing and then putting it back into their fleet and selling it to customers whenever they want. So that's a huge strategic advantage that they bring, and that's why car sharing might make sense for them. Yeah.
Okay.
But other
Okay.
things might not make sense for if Volkswagen wanted to go into, I don't know, pet care. It doesn't make sense, right? They have
Mm,
nothing like what they have nothing to leverage, and they would be slower than a pet care VC startup.
mm. Yeah, that's super interesting. So it's not a case of one's better than the other. It's kind of horses for courses, different things, different scenarios suit different ways of building. That makes
Yeah.
sense, to be honest. But yeah, when I was doing my research, I mean, some of the names. So they said I found an article that said Twitter was an example of a venture builder. I don't know if that was right though.
Mhm.
Food Panda. Um, BP's Launchpad program, which basically um, created ventures that will help tackle sustainable energy and renewable energy. Um, so yeah, I suppose that does make sense. For example, if we take BP's example, where they have an advantage over um, energy production and the way things are done, they have the expertise, but they just need to move that into a different field. So that makes sense for venture building.
Yeah, exactly. So the BP, I'm not well versed with BP in the specifics of it, but yes, that's a classic venture building. You basically have a company that has a lot of cash currently. They have a business that is working currently, but it might not or will not work in 20 years from now. So what they need to do now is to actually use that cash to build a new future. And it
Mm,
makes sense, obviously, for an energy company then to think about sustainable energy. How can I play a role there, right? And you see that with all the energy and utility companies that they move into that direction. Um, Now I haven't looked at the launch pad, but this kind of initiatives are built by most of the larger energy companies currently.
yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, that's super interesting. Well, I've learned something already in just 15 minutes of
Welcome.
talking to you. Free knowledge. So let's talk about yourself for a little bit. So you are
Mhm.
a partner, an associate partner at Bridgemaker now.
Yeah.
So what is exactly is your particular role within the venture builder?
Yeah. Um, so my role is it works a little bit like a partner in a consultancy. I get in touch with corporates, or they get in touch with us, and we try to, before we start a project, try to think what makes sense for them, right? And then we scope the project, or we scope the venture, commercially, but also what wants to be achieved. And then once we start, I'm sort of an oversight over our project team. So in a venture setups, our partners would be usually on the board of the venture, right? So not an operational role, but in a strategic steering role, together with our corporate partners and other investors that might be on the board as well.
Okay. When you say you're sort of scoping the market, I mean, how does that work in practice? How do you know when you're jumping in? Because Bridgemaker, I'm guessing, it's a lot of time, money, and people throwing into a venture. And I'm guessing, I mean, this is an assumption. Do correct me that the nature of the beast, you don't kind of chuck yourself into like lots of different things every year. It's not like a massive diversified portfolio like maybe an investor, because of obviously the amount of time and energy. So, are you kind of you know just a few projects per year and really picking what Bridgemaker throws their resources into?
Yeah, correct. So there's, I mean, the way we get projects, there's two ways. One is the corporates approach us. The way I mentioned before is they have a product, and they sort of struggle to get it to the market. Sometimes they are also earlier. So BP or the likes of BP might say, hey, look, this is the situation we are in. The oil business will not last forever. What can we do? Right. So then we help them basically develop a new idea. But what we also do is that we look in the market and we see things that are happening, and we think ourselves what might make sense for other corporates. So for example, now there's the quick commerce, right? And
Mm,
it's happening now in food, of course. It happened with drinks also. It's happening with pharmaceuticals, but there's other industries as well that might jump on that might jump on the possibility to order at all, right? So we might approach corporates and say, hey, look, this is what we see in the market. I think you should be early investing in a certain topic, and we can help you build it.
Mm. What are you seeing now then? Could you give any examples of what emerging trends are in the market that corporates maybe should jump into, whether they're in car, energy, delivery, fintech?
Um, yeah, I mean, there's loads of things. I mean, there's in broader terms, a few years ago we had the wave of digitization. So putting a traditional brick and mortar business online, right? That would be a classic venture building case, and sometimes it would change from selling the product to putting it in a subscription offering. You can do it with cars, but you can do it with loads of other stuff as well, right? Especially in the B2B sector now, like equipment as a service is a huge thing. And the second or another big wave that we have seen emerging really in the last 2-3 years is sustainability. So
Yeah.
in the way I see it, it emerged from corporates knowing, okay, we have to do something to show on some reports that we are somewhat sustainable, to now thinking, actually, what kind of sustainable new businesses can I build, right? How can I not only sort of do some initiatives to reduce CO2, but how can I make a business out of it? So it's about
Mm.
sustainable packaging, new ways of localized services, and so forth. So there's a lot of topics that we see, right? And usually when you follow industries the same way VCs do, you can see it's happening in one industry first, but and then the other industries catching up in a matter of years and sometimes decades, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I imagine that's an absolutely huge topic now. I see kind of startups propping up all the time around climate tech, and um, I actually work with a company that does like fleet management software to reduce lorries and freight CO2 emissions. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a massively kind of growing sector. Um, but what about kind of you yourself and your journey? So you obviously know your stuff, you know a lot, and you enunciate it incredibly well. But looking at your profile, I mean, how old are you now?
I'm 35.
35. Look, I
Yeah.
feel you look younger, I've got to say.
Thank
Um,
you.
but
Unfortunately not.
um, yeah, I mean your profile makes interesting reading. If I've just got it up in front of me now, you know you've been C-level, you've been COO, you've been director, you've moved into obviously the venture world as well.
Mhm.
I know at university you studied sort of business, so this kind of thirst for the business world and venture and things like that, is this something you kind of always envisioned yourself doing, or have you kind of just fallen into it? How's that all panned out for you?
Yeah, not at all, I would say. I come from a fairly humble background, I would say. So my father is a factory worker. He never went to university, and my mom is a primary school teacher. So she was actually the pioneer in my family. So my parents both have three siblings, and in the whole large family, my mom was the first one to go to university.
Okay.
And now my generation of like my cousins, I would say half of them went to university. So you can see we actually picked up with the development of the country. So but in terms of my background, so I come from a small town with those parents who were very supportive, but they obviously did not guide me through a business career, if you want. Yeah. So
Mm,
my impulse back then was rather that I wanted to move out of my small town, and we had a scheme in Germany where companies would pay for your studies. So in my case, that was BASF, and conveniently, it was located on the other side of Germany. So I moved from the eastern border to the western border. So I thought that's cool. I get to sort of dive into a new world and then can experience. And then I went to Ludwigshafen to study at BASF, and a lot of my peers, they were actually from entrepreneurial families, had fathers, engineers and founders and so forth. And there I sort of got this knack of the business world. But my initial impulse was rather to sort of move out of my hometown, and it was
yeah.
a vehicle to do that. Otherwise, I think I might have studied mathematics, but I lacked the imagination back then what you could do with mathematics.
Mm. Did you did that kind of come naturally to you in terms of knowing that you needed to kind of get out and there's a big wide world out there that you need to go and explore?
Yeah, I mean, it was the pre-social network world, right? Where you were
Yeah.
not necessarily, if you were sitting in a small town, you were not necessarily connected to the trends of the big cities. So it was sort of, yeah, it was a feeling, not a knowledge, that there must be something out there, outside my small town, that should be explored, right? And then, yeah, I mean, I went to Ludwigshafen, but I went to Shanghai, I went to Singapore in my bachelor's, all because I wanted to see what there is. And the more I went out, the more I realized, so there's actually a lot out there that
Mm,
I was not aware of, right? And that way I always like sort of explored further and explored new things.
mm. Uh, if you had sort of your time again, do you kind of wish? There's one thing I always think. So my mum was a university lecturer, so like very academic and like education wise, kind of very strong. But the business side of things, even just education about money and things like that, I just never really was there. Um, and I sometimes think if I had that kind of, I don't know, maybe that entrepreneurial spark sort of growing up, would I have kind of gone into things earlier, or would I have just been turned off by it? Um, I don't know. What do you think about that with your situation? Do you think that actually not having that influence at all in the household and the family has helped you, or do you think you'd be further ahead?
Yeah, it's both ways. I see a lot of people, or yeah, a lot of adults who struggle with the expectations their parents had. And for me, my parents were supportive, but they didn't really have the expectation for me to do something. So I could complain that I had basically no mentor who would show me what it is to create a business. And my mom would basically, if I had told her at the age of 20, I'm founding a business, she would have been very scared instead of
Yeah.
encouraging, right? But on the other hand, I was also quite free in doing my in making my decisions. No one pushed me to, I don't, study medicine because my father is already a
Mm,
doctor, and all that stuff, right? There's a lot of people who run with those grievings, and I don't have that because I was very free to do what I want. At the same time, obviously, some possibilities that I see now in the juniors that apply to Bridgemaker, their perspective of the world is much broader than my perspective of the world was when I was 20. Right?
mm,
And that it is there, and I can't change, and I think everyone has their own circumstances, how they sort of evolve in their lives. And for me, I think at the end everything turned out well. Obviously, with hindsight, I would have wished to do a few things earlier, business-wise, than I ended up doing them, because I needed to, for myself, like explore, right? But I think overall it's fine, and I don't have big regrets, and certainly I don't have any grudge about what my parents did, because I think they did the best they could.
yeah, I agree. Actually, I think kind of similar boats there. Um, in terms of, I think just having that drive to kind of get out and see what's out there, I think that's the most important thing, rather than having someone guide you and the practical knowledge of, say, the business world or entrepreneurship, whatever. I think that drive and that kind of innate spark to get out and just get shit done is the most important thing. And yeah, a pushy parent isn't something that can create that well and definitely sustain it as
Yeah,
well. Yeah, I
yeah,
know so many people. So where I grew up, um, yeah, fairly affluent area, I would say, in just outside London, um,
hmm,
and there's some wealthy families and their kids have just got no drive to what they do because they were just pushed so much down a certain avenue and then just completely kind of rebounded back. And
yeah,
at the age now, I'm 28 now, where you can kind of see that pattern playing out.
yeah. I have to say, so I'm also from the former GDR,
Mm,
and I grew up in the 90s, and I think it's a benefit and also a curse. I never had this, like, none of my friends or friends' parents were super rich, and also none were super poor. We are all the same. So I was totally oblivious to that. What you even see here in Berlin, that like, there's no
yeah.
Lamborghini driving in my hometown, and there's like, even if there's an Audi driving, people would be wow, right? So it's super stable, and you don't have that jealousy or that, why is this person so rich, and some people losing ground because of expectations. I didn't have all of that. At the same time, obviously, you don't grow up with the mentality, oh, I could become super rich. You don't even aspire to it, because none of your peers, you've never seen it, you don't know how it
Mm,
feels. So it's a good and a bad thing, right? It takes away a little bit the ambition, but I will also say I had a really unstressful youth. Yeah, we were just hanging out in our small town, having all the same clothes. There was no competition around these things. So it was, I would say, I had a quite nice youth because of that.
That is super interesting. So even after kind of communism fell, there was still that. Well, I suppose the legacy would kind of live on for a generation or two, wouldn't it, in terms of the economic outlook of the cities. But
Yeah,
even I noticed it if I ever travel around Germany, you can still tell, I would say, whether you're in the east or the west just by looking at the
yeah,
buildings and stuff.
yeah. The houses look ugly. Let's name it. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, yeah.
At least in certain parts, because yeah, they had to rebuild obviously after the World War, and in the communist system, it's state driven, so it's not so,
Hmm.
maybe not so nice. Yeah. There's areas that are really, my hometown looks really nice. It was also small, so it wasn't bombed. Most of the buildings are older. But whatever they rebuild is maybe not so nice. Yeah.
Hmm.
But you have that in the West as well, in the industrial cities. So if you go to Ludwigshafen, the buildings are not necessary. It's very practical. Basically, they had to build an industrial city in the 60s. It doesn't look pretty either.
Yeah.
So yeah, but you can see it. Yeah.
So you and your friends at school, did all your parents then do the same kind of jobs and that kind of same sort of income level and socio-economic class?
Yeah, so the classic setup, my setup was pretty much a classic setup. So the man would do a manual job, like being a factory worker, like my dad was, or working on the construction side, this kind of stuff. There were some, the I would say, the early entrepreneurs in the early 90s, when the wall fell. There was a lot of business to be made. So basically, 16 million ex-GDR people needed insurance. So selling life insurance was a way to get super rich in Eastern
Mm.
Germany, for example, right? And then I know a few who actually did not very well in the GDR. They quit their jobs and they did their job, and they suddenly were the richest. They were not very well regarded in the GDR, and 2 years later they were the richest people around. So it was quite funny. But most of the setups were similar in my town, at least similar to my setup. Father doing a manual labor job, mother doing a more educated, in today's terms, a more educated job. So in GDR, my father with his labor job earned more than my mother. And when the wall fell, it changed, and my mother earned more than my father. And that continues to date. That in the GDR, I read a statistic recently that at least in parts, women earn more than men. And that's actually one thing. This whole gender equality thing, it wasn't a topic for me either. Like, I didn't have a stay-at-home mom. None of my friends had a stay-at-home mom. We didn't know that, and it was not a thing that men were supposed to work and women were to stay at home. So that's a positive thing of the GDR. Because they needed
Mm.
labor, they pushed the women into work very early on.
Mm. Yeah, that is super, super interesting. I never even kind of thought, I mean, more ignorance from my side, that even after the wall fell, I suppose, but those patterns would stay for a very, very long time. Do you think there's anything from that time that has stuck with you? So I don't know, obviously ambition and making money and things like that wasn't a thing, but you seem to have obviously bucked that trend and progressed a lot. And I mean, if anyone, obviously your LinkedIn profile link is going to be in the show notes, and take a look. It's quite the read. Um, so where has that particular thing come from, do you think?
And I mean, um, I think one thing that was different between me and some of my peers at school is that I question things more. So, for example, there is a bit in our parents in the East, some of them suffered. So they earned less, or the men who earned more than their wives suddenly earned less than their wives. They were put out of jobs for a while, then came back and struggled. So, and they have this grievance against the West.
Mm,
We have lost, we have been fooled, and all that stuff. And I heard things like, because you're from the East, you will never make it.
mm,
And I was like, why? Like, for example, when I said I want to go to the West and some company will sponsor my study, there were people who said, no, they will never take you. They will take West German people. I was like, I mean, why? If you think logically from a company's perspective, why would a company even do that? I know that they go to Poland and to Romania to open factories there if it's cheaper. Why won't they hire me if I'm better? I never got that, and I questioned it. And at the end, I was right. I mean, BASF didn't care where I
yeah.
was from, right? So that way I was different, and sort of challenged things. And some never challenged, and some of them now, sadly, they're still there voting for, I would say, let's say the wrong parties, yeah, and having a lot of grievance about a situation that they are not aware of that they could actually change themselves, but they put other people at fault for it. Right? I never had that. I said, I believe I can do whatever I want. I just don't know how, but I figured out.
Yeah, you had faith in yourself as an individual to
Yeah.
make it work. Is there any? I mean, definitely. I'm guessing not now, but maybe when you were a kid, was there any stigma or discrimination between West German and an East German? How did that kind of continue at all?
I mean, especially my parents' generation, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, they feel that they lost out. Even today, most of the important jobs are taken by Western Germans. So if you look at, for example, these boards of the DAX companies, it's around 95% Westerns and 5% Easterns. There's more foreigners in DAX boards than Eastern Germans. In the
Wait, say that
government,
again. That
there's
95%.
yeah, there's I don't know the newest, but 3-4 years ago it was in all German DAX companies there were like 4 Eastern Germans in boards. And if you look at
Wow.
if you look at the German government, if you look at the top 3 levels, so that's about, you have ministry, secretary, undersecretary. If you take that whole bunch of people, there's around 160, 170, and there's 10 Eastern Germans, and the rest is Western German. So there's, I don't have that. I also see where it comes from. I don't think there's an active discrimination. It's just that in Eastern Germany, there's a lot of people like me who didn't have that vision, basically, and the parties are from Western Germany. They are Western German dominated, and then if you are in the local Eastern German branch of the party, you might not make it to the higher things. But there's grievances in my parents' generation about how that whole thing was dealt with, and I think in my generation it was a bit different. At least for me personally, I always thought I have exactly the same opportunity as someone growing up in Cologne. Now I realize, I mean, parents do make a difference, and some of them maybe were faster, but for me it turned out super well. Yeah? But I always thought I have pretty much the same opportunities. But my parents' generation, they had those grievances, and they have or had and still have statistics to point to. Yeah.
Yeah. God,
And it's in all parts of the even if you take football. I think in Bundesliga you have 1 Eastern German club and 17 Western German, and second Bundesliga, I don't know, it's like 2 to 16, something like that. So wherever you look, yeah, it's not Germany in that sense, in the way my parents' generation understands it. It has not merged, but it was acquired by Eastern Germany. Yes, it's very clear who is the boss. Yeah. And basically what happened, and I think it made sense in the 90s, they sent over a lot of people to manage the German factories and companies, because in Eastern Germany, no one knew how a market economic company would work. So they suddenly had Western German bosses, and they were like, I mean, why? So you see where it comes from. But I think my generation and my friends, it was not such of a topic.
100%. Well, they say even in business, there's no such thing as mergers, only acquisitions, and you can see that in countries as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. I mean, I've been working in Germany for a long, long time, and no one's really kind of pointed out those stark facts.
Yeah, because I mean, what you see now is that I mean, Berlin was mixed, right, between East and West, and in Berlin you don't have that at all. And actually the startup hub is in Mitte, which is former Eastern Berlin. So you don't have that here, and I don't feel it here at all.
No.
But what I'm telling you is really the perspective of a small town in Eastern Germany.
Yeah.
Where this is pretty much still alive, and you see it in the voting results, for example. You see it every time.
Yeah, fascinating, absolutely fascinating. What does the future hold for yourself and your career? Where do you look to in the years ahead?
So my midterm goal is I want to drive corporate venture building forward. So there have been a lot of successful corporate ventures, but on a smaller scale, and I think it could be much more prominent, and it needs to be. I mean, if you look at the German industry, it's quite old compared to, for example, the American industry. Like if you see the largest German companies, they are much older than the largest American companies. So there is definitely a need for us to modernize those companies and the business of those companies. And I want to take part in driving that change. Yeah, I think there's a lot of merit in building something from scratch, but most of the German workforce is actually employed at larger German companies, and we have to make them future-proof. We have to find ways how our hidden champion can still be hidden champions in 2030 or 2040. And I want to drive that. I think there's a lot of work to do in venture building. Not all works very well to date. We as Bridgemaker can become better. The corporates have to become better. But that's sort of what I want to achieve. And besides then, I will see where life takes me. I've always approached it like that. I'll look at opportunities, of course, if something comes up. But for now, I'm really, it's a sort of, for me, really an intellectual challenge to improve the way corporate venture building is done, and also to make it more prominent in the business world, like to make corporates also aware of it. Yeah, that's my thing. And besides, I have a little family that I nourish. I try to be a modern father the same way my father was a modern father, taking care of my child and giving him maybe some the freedom that I have had, but also the perspective that I maybe lacked. And try to not show him the 2020 way, but I always try to think like, how will his world look like in 2040, 2050, right? And what worked for me might not work for him, and my daughter's on the way and for her. So that's my sort of second big pillar in life.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, super exciting times. Well, we'll finish there, Alex. I mean, fascinating, insightful, incredibly valuable as well to myself and to the listeners. So thank you so much for coming on today and for your precious time this morning.
Yeah, thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for listening to the Building Our World podcast. Every view, stream, and download is massively appreciated. If you're new here, then please go back through the catalogue. There's some great gems from some of the brightest and the best in Berlin tech. And if you really like what you hear, then please do hit that follow and subscribe button. That's it for now, but until next time, goodbye.